The Witherspoon Brothers Necromancer Show, an introduction. Copyrighted by DarkWood Manor Productions, all rights reserved. Written by Lewis Brown and edited by Heather Good. Greetings, curious spectators and seekers of the supernatural. I am Luther Witherspoon. Along with my brother Eugene, we are the proprietors of the Witherspoon Brothers Necromancer Show. We have staged exhibitions all over the world, for more years than most of you would likely care to imagine. If the name of our little attraction has piqued your curiosity, then read on and I will explain what we do, and some of what you will find in our Necromancer Show. But be warned, this is not for the timid, or for those whose sanity is a thin veil easily pierced by the darker realities of this world. What we have to tell and show you is indeed of the shadow realms of this world, so if you are faint of spirit and not strong of mind, then stop here. Return yourself to the safer pages of the Saturday Evening Post or the Good Farmer's Almanac. As for the rest of you, follow me. As the name of our show suggests, both my brother and I are necromancers by trade. If you have no idea what that means, please do not feel too bad about your lacking education. Necromancy is an esoteric and antiquarian practice. Not many know of it in this day and age. Necromancy is the art of raising and controlling the dead. The skills and devices required to perform such feats have been around since the earliest alchemist. It is a time-honored tradition among some cultures, and a cursed one among others. However, we Witherspoons are not your average necromancers. We specialize within the field of necromancy. What does this mean? First, we do not raise the dead. I find the act of raising the dead rather ghoulish, and we are not the ghouls that some would make us out to be. I know that raising the dead sounds instrumental to the whole idea of necromancy. However, our specialty lies within the second part of the term's definition. We do not raise the dead, but we do control the dead. For you see, the dead that we take dominion over have already risen. We are the masters of the vampire and the spawn thereof. Yes, my friend, vampires do exist. Vampires have been around since the beginnings of history. They have been feeding quietly off humanity long before there were ever necromancers such as myself to control them. Today there are few free vampires in the world thanks in no small part to the work of my brother and myself. Most, but unfortunately not all vampires and their foul spawn, are under my control and are exhibited within our show. Allow me to explain to you a little about vampires. I'm sure you think you know all there is to know about bloodsuckers from dime store novels you have read or the picture shows you may have seen. Some of the myths propagated through the years do ring true. Vampires do avoid the sun, but not because it makes them glitter or glow. It is mainly because it will kill them. They also dislike garlic in most cases, but I have seen some strong enough to eat Italian. Crosses, on the other hand, have no effect on vampires whatsoever. They are monsters, not God-fearing Christians. Vampires grow their numbers by passing their blood into humans, and in some cases, lesser creatures. However, if you were thinking of drinking some vampire blood so you too can live forever, I would have to strongly advise against it. Yes, these hemovores do live forever. And living forever is very nice. But vampire blood does not always turn one into a vampire. Quite often, one who ingests vampiric sanguine becomes a half-dead. A half-dead is similar to a vampire in that it does crave blood, but the vampiric blood causes them to rapidly decay rather than preserve them the way it does a vampire. Their body and their minds rapidly rot away. I suppose they would also live forever like a vampire, but due to the decay, they usually just stop functioning and turn to dust. Half-deads have been preserved in certain incidences by various means, but it is never pretty. So if you find the lure of the eternal life of the vampire calling you, bear in mind, it is just as likely you will turn into a rotting zombie half-dead if you drink vampire blood. Allow that to be food for thought before you make any changes in your mortality. Vampires come in various forms. The curse, or gift of vampirism, shapes its victims differently. Some remain very human, appearing with only the smallest signs that they are creatures of the night reflected in their appearance. Others become more beastly than you can possibly imagine. Who knows why? It could be science, or it could be magic. I do know that Eugene and I have collected and killed all kinds over the years. Some of these creatures' names have been known to history, some quite famous in fact, and some have remained in the shadows for all time. That is, of course, until we put them in our collection. It is our collection that we put on display and that we invite you to come see. Now, before you ask, the show is perfectly safe for the most part. We have the vampires totally under our control. The only harm that may come to you, as I warned in the beginning, is to your sanity, for seeing these creatures will truly alter your perception. Before you honor us with your attendance at our show, I would like to tell you about some of the different individual and types of vampires you will be seeing in the flesh. If the tales themselves do not scare you away, then you may be ready for the Witherspoon Brothers Necromancer Show. Elizabeth Frankenstein, the Bride. There are few who do not know of the story penned by Mary Shelley about Victor Frankenstein. His obsessive desire to cheat death by creating life in a laboratory led him to create a monster that turned on him. It is a classic story that has value as a cautionary tale, but the truth is far removed from the fiction. Though the majority of the story Mrs. Shelley told was fancy, the main character was flesh and blood truth. Victor Frankenstein was a man. He was a man that is until he became a vampire, and his story is one of tragedy. The young Dr. Frankenstein lived and practiced his trade in Geneva in the late 1700s. He was engaged at an early age to his lifelong love, Elizabeth. By most accounts, they had an enviable life, but that was not to last. After the early passing of his father and mother, Victor became obsessed with defeating death. He began to experiment in ways of holding back death. However, his experimentation quickly proved futile. As he began to realize that science held no answers to his growing quest for eternal life, he turned toward more arcane sources for the knowledge he sought. He soon discovered the stories of vampires and the gift of eternal life they possessed. These tales fueled his obsession. He sought information on these creatures in every ancient text and grimoire he could dig up. He plowed through the musty old volumes, learning every way a person may become a vampire. Soon he convinced himself that this was the only way to obtain life everlasting. Victor's search often led him far from Geneva. He traveled to every land that offered any hope of information on what he came to term as the gift. On one such trip to the Celtic Isles, he found it. While investigating what legends said was the burial grounds of an ancient Druid sect, Victor came across a tomb in a hillside grove of old oaks. The tomb was the prison of a legendary vampire witch known as Mother Dewfinger. She too is a part of our collection. Her story is as interesting as Victor's is, but I will get to that soon enough. Victor, in his zeal, did not read the warning on the surrounding stones. The arisen Dewfinger set upon young Victor with a century-long thirst. She nearly drained him dry, but with his last breath he begged for his gift. For setting her free, she granted him his wish, turning him into a fellow bloodsucker by giving him some of her blood. Victor made his way back to Geneva by traveling only at night. He made it home the night before his wedding to Elizabeth was scheduled to take place. Not wanting to go through eternity without his beloved, Victor passed his gift of vampirism into Elizabeth. But as I have stated before, not everyone that gets a dose of vampire blood becomes a vampire. Some become half-deads, zombies doomed to have their bodies rot away. Elizabeth was one of those that did not become a vampire. Once Victor realized his bride's fate, he set about trying to keep her from withering away. The vampire blood would keep her alive forever, but her body and her mind would rot at an accelerated rate. After a given period, most half-deads collapse in a pile of rotten skin and bones, a fate the young scientist was not willing to leave his bride to. Victor believed that his scientific genius and arcane knowledge could prevent this from happening to her. He took her to his lab, and the battle began. A battle that has lasted over 2 centuries and continues still. Yes, Victor Frankenstein and his once lovely bride are a part of our collection. How we came about them is another story. Even though I'm a businessman, and they are just 2 more specimens for our show, I am a romantic at heart. I allow the 2 lovebirds to stay together, and I let Victor keep practicing his strange form of science that keeps Elizabeth in one piece. It's a horrific and tragic tale for you to behold in our Necromancer Show. Radu, the Forgotten Prince. As a showman, I hate to disappoint my audiences. Unfortunately, in one way I always do. I disappoint them by telling them the truth. Dime store novels and pretty flicker shows have painted certain pictures of vampires that are simply not true. One such lie has been told over and over again, until folks now think it is just the plain gospel. So let me get this out of the way here and now. The Prince of Wallachia, also known as Vlad the Impaler, or the more familiar Dracula, was not a vampire. Hard to believe, I know, especially with all the fictional accounts told of him. In reality, he was just another ordinary human with a really nasty habit of impaling folks. So put it out of your head that you will be seeing Dracula in our Necromancer show. Old Vlad was not a creature of the night. However, his brother Radu is a vampire, and we have him in our collection. Radu Cel Frumos, or Radu the Handsome, as he was once called, came into our possession by fortunate accident. When I was younger, and had first perfected my skills of necromancy, I was as deluded about the truth as many of you have been. I too believed the legends of that famous Count Dracula. Eager to add him to our collection, my brother and I had travelled to Transylvania. Knowing that vampires can, and often do, go into long periods of hibernation, usually deep beneath the ground, I postulated that the famous Count had gone to ground in his homeland. We went to all the places that he may have been resting, and performed certain spells to bring him forth, but due to the fact he is mere fiction, we uncovered nothing. I was gravely disappointed. We were making plans to travel elsewhere to collect more specimens for our show, when some unexpected news found us. There had been reports from a village north of Bucharest of vampire attacks. The attacks had been very recent and very vicious. Hearing this, we changed our plans and made passage to the village. We arrived in the village of Krasny to find that in a short period of time, something had decimated the population. The remaining residents did not give us a warm greeting, but that did not matter to us. We had come to acquire a new bloodsucker for our show. Saving their filthy peasant hides was just fortunate for them. After we inspected the local graveyard to make sure no grave was disturbed and no crypt had been opened, we sought out the next most logical place for a vampire to hide. A series of small caves near the village made perfect daytime lodging for a night creature. We went there just before dusk, knowing that the thing would soon be able to rise. At the mouth of the cave, we summoned the necrotic fiend. What came forth was the foulest creature I had seen. Its ragged black cloths, cloak and battered red armor were from centuries past. Long strands of matted hair hung before a shrunken, shriveled face, colored a grotesque moonlight blue. His lips pulled back in a snarl to reveal crimson-tinted fangs, freshly stained by villager blood. His long, even by vampire standard, fingers bore even longer nails caked in grime. As we took control of him via the powers of the necromancer's art, I noticed the emblem on his tarnished breastplate. His armor bore the mark of the family Dracul, the Order of the Dragon. I felt for sure that all our earlier summoning had indeed called forth Count Dracula himself. As we do with all newly acquired vampires, we interrogated him and probed his mind. Much to our chagrin, we learned that this was not Dracula. Our summoning had indeed called this creature forth from hibernation and brought about that unfortunate incident with the village, but our prize was Radu the Handsome. Of course, he was far from handsome, and from what we gleaned from his mind, the only vampire in his family. He is a crafty and savage beast from a more barbaric age, a true gem in our show of undead fiends. Crona, the horologist. I'm not sure what Crona is. I do know that he is undead, but whether he is more half-dead or more vampire, I'm not certain. He is an anomaly in a realm of anomalies. My brother and I were attending an auction in Moscow when we found this odd creature. An old Russian circus was closing and selling off various artifacts from their show. One of the items that came up for sale was from their freak show exhibit. They had claimed it was the mummified remains of a vampire. Like most sideshow exhibits, it appeared to be a not-so-clever forgery. The head was a mishmash of dirty bandage-type material, lashed together with pins, buttons, and odd bindings. The eyes were sunken black holes, hidden behind jeweler glasses, that were permanently attached to the sides of the head. Long grey hair sprouted erratically from the wrappings on the back of its head. It wore a tattered jacket over an odd mechanized vest. The only remotely vampiric-appearing thing about him was his teeth. They almost seemed embedded in the wrapping, with distinct vampire fangs springing forth on either side of his mouth. It was a unique novelty for sure, But it was not a vampire from what I could tell. I speculated it was a life-size doll, fashioned by a disturbed mind for the sake of the freak show and its patrons. Most vampires wouldn't allow themselves to be carted around as some mummified thing. I purchased the curio, as it fascinated me. Once it was in my possession, I began to pick up something from it. I'm not a psychic. I can only probe the minds of the undead to certain degrees, but I could have sworn this doll thing was speaking to my mind, a whisper that I could not quite make out. I dismissed it as my own imagination getting the best of me, for the doll-like thing did have a visual effect on me. Time passed, and I displayed it in our show alongside the real vampires. It captivated both our audiences and our vampires. As an exhibit, my mummified vampire was well worth the price I had paid for him at auction, and I was satisfied that he was not, nor ever had been, a vampire. Of course, I was very wrong. It was Eugene who brought to light the true nature of the thing. For those of you who do not know, my brother Eugene is not a master of coordination. In fact, I would go as far as to say he was a klutz, but he is my flesh and blood, so I will refrain from labeling him so. In any case, it was Eugene who, while feeding the vampires in our captivity, the copious amounts of blood that they require, spilled a large pail of blood on my curio. The spilled blood soaked into the doll thing like water into a sponge. As I began to berate dear Eugene for his carelessness, a very audible ticking sound started to fill the room. The ticking was coming from our mummified vampire. The whisper that I had once heard returned in my head as a scream. The only words I could make out were blood and time. The thing actually started to move. I quickly performed the necromancy spell upon it, and instructed Eugene to bring more blood for our new friend. After it was well fed, I probed its mind as I do all new vampire acquisitions. My probe did not turn up much. Its mind was full of equations of time, mechanical schematics, and the thirst for blood. I could glean no history, no origin, no name. I could not even be sure it was a vampire. The thirst for blood was there, but it just as well could be a half-dead kept alive by some mechanical means. To this day, I'm still not sure. Whatever he is, I think that he may have been a clockmaker or a genius, because his gift and obsession with mechanical time remains. We call him Crona, and he ticks away with his clocks in our Necromancer Show. Mother Dewfinger, the crone. Mother Dewfinger is, in the classical sense, a witch. One wouldn't think a witch would be a vampire as well, however she seems to blend into both roles quite well. Even though she is now under my control, her mind is closed to me. Her true origins are hidden from me. I attribute this to her dual nature. Her witch half is able to shield her thoughts from me. What I know of her I learned during her hair-raising capture, and from other vampires. She had been imprisoned in a tomb somewhere in the Celtic Isles around the 4th century AD. I do not know who imprisoned her, or why they just didn't kill her. Whoever had the ability to trap her for centuries surely had the knowledge and ability to end her preternatural life. She stayed entombed there until June of 1783, when she was released by Victor Frankenstein, which I give count of in my story of the bride. I often wonder if her dormancy was of her own choosing, but why such a powerful vampire would go to ground for so long is unknown. She came to my attention sometime after her rebirth. I was called upon by a priest that I had befriended in another undead matter. He was concerned for a small village on the shores of Galway Bay. After receiving a disturbing letter from a fellow clergyman in the village of Kildevlin, he had completely lost contact with anyone from the area. He sent others to investigate, but they never returned. Once he showed me the letter, my brother and I made passage to Ireland. When we arrived in the village of Kildevlin, we found it to be abandoned by all appearances. My instincts told me that there was an undead presence in the empty village. It is not often that I have encountered situations while plying my trade that have caused my skin to crawl. But the empty village of Kildevlin did just that to me on that day. We waited until nightfall and went to the village square. I was certain there was at least one vampire responsible for the state of the village, and I intend to have it for our collection. As usual, we used our skills to summon forth any vampire in the area. It wasn't long before a nearby cellar door creaked open. From its dark depths came a small cloaked figure with a long staff. As it made its way toward us, I knew we had found our quarry. As I began my necromantic incantation to take possession of the fiend, it threw the hood of its cloak back to reveal a disturbing face. The crone face that stared at us was a gelatinous mass of wrinkles that hung from a skull. In the midst of that horrid face, She had a third glowing green eye on her forehead. I have never seen a vampire with a third eye, and this made me hesitate in performing the necromancer ritual to take control of her. As she continued to approach us, she bore her fangs, removing the doubts about her bloodlust. I quickly started to speak the words of necromancy, but before I could finish, she hissed, "Necromancer filth!" She waved her staff at us while uttering a spell. Instantly, my brother and I found we could no longer speak, and therefore could no longer take this vampire under our control. A feeling of overwhelming terror filled us. That terror soon turned to panic. The old hag once again raised her staff, and with more words of some ancient tongue, she called forth the villagers. Every cellar door in all the surrounding buildings sprang open, and the once absent villagers came forth, some with fangs gleaming, others bearing the marks of half-deads. They quickly made their way toward us, intent on our demise. At this sight, my brother completely panicked. Like a silent stampeding rhino, he charged at the witch. She had no time to react. She hit the ground with Eugene landing square on top of her and her staff. Being a vampire, she did not break, but the wooden staff gave way like a dried twig. With the breaking of the staff, my voice returned, and I resumed the necromancy ritual, taking all the undead into my possession. We later learned that the witch's name was Mother Dewfinger. Why she had transformed the entire village of Kildevlin, I am uncertain. Most vampires, out of self-preservation, try to avoid making large numbers of fellow blood drinkers. As I said before, Dewfinger's mind has never been open to me, so the mysteries that surround her remain in place. We had to slaughter most of the other villagers that had been turned. I only like to keep them if they can add to the quality of our show. Mother Dewfinger is just such an oddity, and she is in our collection for you to examine firsthand. The Nosferata. I consider myself an expert on vampires, if indeed anyone can be an expert on such a vast and ever-mutating subject. Even with all my knowledge of the subject, I cannot explain the different effects, both physically and mentally, that vampiric blood has on those who are infected with it. As I have stated before, not all people transform into vampires when they ingest the cursed blood. Some become zombie-like things that I refer to as half-deads. As for the physical appearance of the ones that do become vampires, that can vary greatly. Most take on subtle changes to their form, such as the characteristic fangs, whitening of the skin, and other slight physical variances compared to their former human self. In a good many cases, they may be able to continue to pass as human in some circles. I usually do not care to collect the ones that look too human, because they do not make good specimens for the show. While some do look mostly human, others take on more monstrous forms. At the extreme level, these creatures can be as far from human appearance as I dare say anything formerly human could possibly get. As a whole, I refer to these types as Nosferata. The Nosferata are a varied group. The common thread is that they appear more like monsters or demons than other vampires. Some take on the appearance of other creatures that feed on blood. Many appear much like a vampire bat, some like leeches, and others are snake-like. Also, a Nosferata's temperament often matches their appearances. As a group, they tend to be more savage and ferocious when it comes to getting their food. Their feral bloodlust seems to overpower them. The only aspect of their former nature that remains in them is their human ability to be cunning predators. From my experience, Nosferata are nasty to deal with on most levels, but they are such wonderful pieces for our collection. I have a more difficult time taking and keeping them under my control via my necromancy than I do with most vampires. But their value to the show makes the effort worth it. In the wild, the Nosferata can be both a solitary predator and a pack hunter. It has often perplexed me on how similar appearing Nosferata form packs. It is my educated opinion that if one receives the vampire blood from a Nosferata, then they themselves become a Nosferata-type vampire of similar appearance. This would allow for the forming of packs of similar appearing creatures. I'm no scientist. I am simply a showman, but I have experimented a bit over the years with this theory. I cannot say my results are conclusive. These creatures are far from cooperative in matters of science or anything else for that matter. But my results lead me to believe I'm correct in my theory. The Nosferata are a large and varied category of bloodsuckers, to be sure. They are truly the things that we fear may be lurking in the dark, and indeed they are. You can see these fiendish creatures in their various forms with relative safety to your own person in our Necromancer Show. The Croatoan. There is a pack, or tribe as the case may be, of Nosferata called the Croatoan. Those of you familiar with history may recall that name. In 1590, the English colony on Roanoke Island disappeared. The colony itself did not vanish, but its inhabitants, over 100 men, women and children, disappeared. The only clue left behind as to what happened to them was the word Croatoan, carved into a tree in large, ominous letters. This mystery has perplexed historians for countless years. However, it is no mystery to me, and I will share the secret with you. The citizens of the Roanoke colony were devoured. For untold centuries, perhaps as long as humans have inhabited the American continent, there has been a tribe of Nosferata living below ground. They are a nomadic tribe that travel the entirety of the North and South American continents via an elaborate series of tunnels and interconnected cave systems. In most cases, they feed on forgotten and misplaced individuals from human communities. However, there have been isolated incidents, such as the Roanoke colony, where they feed on an entire settlement, town, or people. In the case of the Roanoke colony, I believe the colonists were essentially out of place. The Croatoan had fed on Native Americans for centuries, and that is all they knew. When they saw the white-bearded, isolated Europeans at the colony, they must have seen the opportunity for a feast that would go unnoticed. Of course, this is just my speculation on the matter. The only other mass extermination that I'm sure the Croatoan were responsible for was the Anasazi of the American Southwest. Several hundred years before the Croatoan decimated Roanoke colony, they completely annihilated the Anasazi people. Up until that point in time, most Native American tribes that had become aware of the existence of the Croatoan accepted them as a dangerous predator best avoided. However, the Anasazi were no mere tribe. They had developed into a large civilization by the 11th century, and like many civilizations, they chose to eradicate their natural predators. Unfortunately for them, the predators won in this case. They killed nearly all the Anasazi people. The few that remained blended into other Native American tribes in order to escape. I'm sure the question you are asking is whether the Croatoan still exist. Allow me to assure you that they do indeed. It is rare that they destroy entire populations anymore. Modern society offers up more than enough forgotten and misplaced people for them to feed upon. Very few know of their existence now. They simply travel below ground, unnoticed, and feeding on what we really don't want anyway. Of course, this is how most vampires exist, but none are as organized and long-lived as the Croatoan. The few that we possess for our show are vicious and crafty. They haven't taken well to their captivity, but they make for a frightening exhibit that you can witness in our Necromancer Show. Mare, the nightmare statues. You have seen a mare vampire before. If you have ever been in an old crypt, ancient cathedral, or any dimly lit place that includes stone statuary in their decor, they were there. The mare are the most insidious of all the vampires I have ever encountered. They appear to be stone statues that one would expect to see in places of the dead. For them, it is the perfect defense, and more importantly, it is the ideal place for them to feed. A man of my profession is not given to being stricken with fear. It wouldn't be a valued trait in the pursuit of my trade. However, these vampires make my blood run cold. Not only do they appear like stone statues, but they also feel like stone to the touch. For all intents and purposes, they are stone statues, until they strike. Once they decide to attack, they move incredibly quickly. These traits alone make these vampires extremely horrifying. However, what I find the most disturbing about them is that their minds are as stone still as they appear. I can still control them, but when I search for their thoughts, all I get is cold silence. Of course, I maintain some of these terrifying undead statues for you to see, but just hope you don't see them move. Dr. Tantalus's Vampire Freak Show. I do not like to brag, but I can't deny the truth. The Witherspoon brothers are the best necromancers and showmen you will ever see. That is just the truth of the matter. Yes, we have had pretenders to our throne. Other would-be necromancers and two-bit showmen have tried to make a play for audiences, but they all have shortly fallen by the wayside. However, some time back there was a show that had the potential to give us a run for our money. Dr. Tantalus's Vampire Freak Show started to gain a lot of notoriety in certain circles. They provided a show similar to ours with vampires and unfortunate half-deads. The Vampire Freak Show's quickly growing fame did not concern me. I knew that our production was far superior. As a professional courtesy, Eugene and I went to see Dr. Tantalus's show. I was surprised at what we found. The show was nothing to speak of. Vampires and some strange variations thereof were made to perform tricks for the amusement of the audience. Nothing gave me any concern, but Dr. Tantalus did have one jewel in his collection. He had acquired the elusive Bloody Jack. Bloody Jack is the vampire responsible for the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper, as well as many other unsolved serial killer murders throughout time. Bloody Jack was near impossible to catch. I know because I had tried many times before I encountered him in the Vampire Freak Show. After the show was over, Dr. Tantalus invited us back behind the curtains to see his operation. This is when I discovered that the good doctor was using cheap tricks and haphazard magics to control his vampires. A dangerous situation at best. He housed his creatures as if they were savage mental patients. He kept his strange collection of bloodsuckers in padded cells and straight jackets. I assumed this was the safest way to keep them given his tenuous hold over them. The state in which he kept his fiends did not concern me. What gave me pause is what he was doing with their blood. He was experimenting with it. He and his vampire nurse Jane Toppen were doing things with the vampire sanguine to force it to mutate. Some of the oddities I had seen perform in his show were not naturally forming vampires, but rather abominations that he had created by force in his lab. He was taking half-deads and injecting them with his forced mutated blood. He explained that each generation of his blood formula created more interesting vampire hybrids. All this concerned me greatly. It was beyond obvious that this gentleman was mad. I did not care how he experimented on his stock, but playing with vampire blood is like playing with fire. We bid Dr. Tantalus farewell that night, and left feeling confident that Dr. Tantalus's Vampire Freak Show did not pose any long-term threat to our own show. His weak necromancy skills combined with his reckless experimenting with vampire blood would soon bring his show to a close. And, as I predicted, some months later Dr. Tantalus made a mistake. While trying to inject his latest bloody concoction into his prized vampire, Bloody Jack, Dr. Tantalus was injected himself. His humanity was lost at his own hands, and the kind of fiend he became was quite disturbing. Once he changed, he lost all control of the vampires in his charge. The small town in which the freak show was set up was overrun with former performers. Of course, Eugene and I came in to clean up and retake the fiends, as well as unfortunate Dr. Tantalus. In modern terms, we sort of considered it a hostile takeover of the Vampire Freak Show by the more adept Witherspoon brothers' Necromancer Show. Dr. Tantalus and his vampire freaks can now be seen safely within our show. I still allow the good doctor to continue to play with his blood. He can do no harm to anyone, not even himself anymore. The Leech. I do not know how vampire blood works, nor do I pretend to. I do know that it changes and mutates living and unliving creatures in very mysterious and bizarre ways. Case in point is a vampire I call the Leech. As far as I can tell, the Leech is half human and half Hemodipsa picta, a leech. I discovered it while touring the Amazon. A tribe of indigenous peoples were being preyed upon by what I determined quickly was a vampire. I was able to track the offending creature after it had attacked the tribe one night. Drawing it from its lair in the jungle, I was able to take it under my control. I was shocked after examining it at close range. I had never seen a vampire like it. If not for the fact that it is a bloodsucker, and I was able to control it via necromancy, I would think it was something other than a vampire. I assume it is some form of Nosferata. Its mind is too primitive for me to read coherently, so I can deduce nothing of its origin. Perhaps it was a human once, or perhaps it was a leech that got infected with vampire blood. Your guess is as valid as mine. Whatever it is truly a horrific monster of the vampire world, and it is yours to marvel at in our Necromancer show. Enriqueta Marti, La Vampira de Barcelona. Vampires are wicked things by their general nature. When a human becomes a vampire, how evil they become depends on what type of human they were before they transformed. Do not get me wrong, all vampires are fiends, but some are more fiendish than others. The ones who had an axe to grind as humans can become quite twisted when they take that step into the world of the undead. Such is the case of Enriqueta Marti. As a human, Enriqueta had an overwhelming hatred for the rich aristocracy of her native country of Spain. As a young woman, in the late 1800s, she worked as a maid for the wealthy of Barcelona. In her position as a servant, she sought ways to undermine her wealthy employers. She learned their secrets and turned them against them when she could. Her petty attempts to cause harm to the upper class only served to fuel her rage. At some point, she turned to prostitution, and that is when she met her sire. A traveling vampire passing through Barcelona gave her the dark gift. The darkness that already existed in her heart was twisted by the induction of her new vampiric blood. The creature that was born was horrific, even by vampire standards. Enriqueta took to feeding exclusively on children. However, that was not all. She saved the remains of the children to create potions and charms that she sold to wealthy women as beauty aids and elixirs of longevity. It was her twisted way of turning the objects of her animosity into cannibals. Even as a vampire, her hatred for humanity had a voice in her actions. A dignitary from Barcelona, who I am not at liberty to name, called upon my brother and me to rid them of Señorita Marti. The police had discovered her, but in order to keep names out of the press and to prevent a panic, they called upon our services. We found Enriqueta in her lair. I have been in vampire lairs before, but this one was most disturbing. The shelves were full of jars containing the body parts of her victims. The small skeletal remains were scattered around the entire flat. Her mixing table was covered in dried gore and held an ancient tome of accursed formulations. Part of me wanted to dispatch her on the spot, but I did not. She is a terrible monster, and we keep her in our show as an unliving cautionary tale to behold. SaintGermain and Madame de Pompadour, the eternal courtiers. From the era of Francis Bacon, and possibly before, to the court of King Edward VIII, SaintGermain and Madame de Pompadour have been the consummate courtiers. Of course, they have also been undead bloodsuckers that fed upon the bluest blood for centuries. Most vampires end up in a niche market when it comes to hunting, but few have occupied such a highly visible niche as these two. Even now, after the age of great monarchies has passed, and after being in my possession for all these many years, the pomp and circumstance that surrounds these two remains intact. Both are still well suited for a royal court of a time gone by, but do not let their manner fool you. When all their social grace and regal airs are removed, they are two vicious vampires that have a taste for rich blood. But in a pinch, your blood would serve them equally well. You can meet these aristocratic fiends in our Necromancer Show. William Quantrill, The Bloody Rebels. The war between the states, or what you may refer to as the Civil War, but I assure you no war has ever been civil, produced an inordinate number of vampires. The most ruthless of these wartime undead were Captain William Quantrill and a dozen or so of his guerrilla fighters. His reign of terror as a bushwhacker along the Missouri-Kansas border was one of cruelty. At the height of his campaign, he was the leader of over 400 men. Sometime after the historically infamous raid on Lawrence, Kansas, Quantrill's forces divided. He and a much smaller band of his rebel fighters ended up on their own. It was this fracturing of his troops and his growing outlaw status that led the black-hearted captain to turn to supernatural means to carry on his psychopathic activities. In the winter of 1864, Quantrill, along with his wife Sarah Catherine, aka Crimson Kate, and his remaining men were camped in Texas. There they encountered and killed a lone vampire. In some bizarre attempt to gain its power, they all drank its blood. It worked. Bloodthirsty in life, Quantrill became even more so once he became a vampire. He and his fiendish band continued to raid and kill with the limitless power of the undead. One of the greatest honors that I have ever had bestowed upon me came in 1865. I was summoned to meet with Abraham Lincoln. The President of the United States called upon me to help him with his vampire bushwhackers. As some of you may be aware, Mr. Lincoln was a vampire hunter himself. He knew full well that Quantrill and his undead men would not stop their bloody campaign, even after the war ended. The President himself could have dealt with the problem, given his abilities, but matters of state prevented him from taking up the hunt. So, it was once again up to Eugene and me to deal with the fiends. We hastily made our way west in the spring of '65. The President had provided intelligence that gave us the next possible targets for the vampiric raiders. Their most recent attacks had been in western Kentucky. Eugene and I formulated a simple plan to draw them out. We posed as Union bounty hunters charged with bringing in Quantrill and his men. We traveled from town to town, making a lot of noise about what we were looking for, so that someone would pass word to the vampires that we were hunting them. They found us one night in the small hamlet of Taylorsville, Kentucky, and we were not ready. We had arrived in the town the day before and found lodging. As usual, we set about making sure everyone was aware of our mission. Most of the people welcomed our hunt, but some gave us very strange looks. Amongst those strange looks, there was a confederate of Quantrill. Apparently the bloodthirsty fiends had a spy in Taylorsville, or perhaps it was a well-preserved half-dead they had taken under their control. Whatever the case had been, that night we got bushwhacked. Assuming we had come to another dead end, we settled into our room for a good night's sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Eugene awoke to answer nature's call. When he lit the lantern beside his bed, he was horrified by the sight it revealed. Our room was filled with fanged outlaws. His loud, piercing, feminine scream alerted me to the problem. Before I had a chance to even think about bringing my necromantic skills into play, the fiends knocked me quite unconscious. By all rights, this should have been the end of the Witherspoon brothers. Ordinarily, vampires do not take prisoners. Why take food hostage? Fortunately for us, these vampires had an agenda beyond feasting. They wanted us for ransom. I awoke to find myself tied to my brother in a dilapidated barn. In the first few seconds of consciousness, I experienced a wave of panic. I was sitting in a puddle of warm fluid, and I feared they had already fed on dear Eugene. I quickly realized that Eugene was fine. The nature's call that had gotten interrupted had just caught up with him. That was the least of my immediate concerns, for I also found that not only was I bound, but both I and Eugene were gagged. Not a position for a necromancer to be in when he relies so heavily on the spoken word to perform his work. I was at the mercy of my prey. As my mind raced for solutions to our predicament, a soft, young hand grabbed my face and jerked my head in its direction. My eyes fell upon a lovely and loathsome creature. I realized it was Crimson Kate, the wife of Quantrill, a moment before her blood-tinged spittle landed in my eye. "Why did you take these meat sacks prisoner? You should just let the boys feed on them where they found them." Her blood-stained eyes never left mine as she spoke. "Their value may be greater than what flows in their veins. I wouldn't want them to be just an expensive meal." The voice came from a deep shadow near the far wall of the barn. Stepping into the lantern light, the voice revealed itself to be Quantrill. "Either way, we won't lose their blood." He smirked as he drew closer to us. A muffled scream let me know that Eugene had also regained consciousness. Quantrill's face portrayed a veneer of calm control, but I could see the monstrous rage and bloodlust that boiled beneath the surface. I have never encountered a vampire any more venomous than the one I saw standing before me that night. Our only hope of surviving hinged on them being unaware that we were necromancers. "Remove their gags so I can question them." He did not know. Needless to say, we survived and added Quantrill, Crimson Kate, and their entire bloody rebel brood to our show. Interesting sidebar to this tale. Even though I have total control of the vampires within our show, they do seem to have differing amounts of control over each other. More powerful fiends will direct lesser ones up to the point I will allow. Shortly after taking the gang of Confederates into the show, they fell under the spell of Mother Dewfinger. The old witch sort of took them on as her personal guard and servants. Very odd indeed, but I allow it, for it is very entertaining to witness and poses no threat, I assure you. The Scimitar. The Scimitar are a unique form of the vampire species. I would categorize them with the Nosferata. for their appearance lends itself more to the monstrous than the human. Of course, as I stated before, I am no scientist. I just catch them and display them for you to experience. The habits of the scimitar are most strange indeed. They are the bedbugs of vampires. They infest houses and sometimes hotels, building nests in dark basements, attics, or crawl spaces behind walls. They come out at night to feed on their host families. They are phantom-like creatures of the shadows, moving so quickly they often go unseen. Their manner mimics those of dream creatures, quick, jagged movements coupled with methodically slow pauses in between. When a child cries that there is something under their bed or in their closet, it is most likely a scimitar. They tend to feed on a family until that family is dead or converted to fiends and taken into the brood. I truly believe you could rid the world of all other vampires, but the scimitar would survive. Some things man is just destined to carry with him as civilization marches forward. Disease, cockroaches, and the scimitar will always thrive as long as man himself does. When you view them in our Necromancer Show, try not to let them follow you home. I can assure you it would be the last infestation you would ever have to worry about again. Bloody Jack, the Alchemist. You no doubt know him as Jack the Ripper, that mutilating killer that terrorized London in 1888. However, that is just one of Bloody Jack's more notorious moments from history. This vampire has left behind him a savage string of murders spanning centuries. My brother and I hunted him for a very long time. Even though now he is in our care, we did not catch him. Much to my surprise, we found him in the possession of another necromancer, our former competitor, Dr. Tantalus, and his vampire freak show. Of course, we acquired Bloody Jack when we acquired Dr. Tantalus and his show. I have already told you that story. Allow me to tell you what I know of the vicious Bloody Jack. I am not sure when Bloody Jack became a vampire. His history is hard to take from him. He has it buried deep in his mind. I do know that he was once an alchemist, a practitioner of an ancient form of magic and science. Practices only referenced in such ancient grimoire as the Necronomicon and other much older tomes. Legends that I have gleaned from the minds of other vampires say that he is the legendary sorcerer Merlin turned vampire. But such fanciful tales are replete within the realm of the bloodsuckers. I do not believe it, nor do I want to believe it. Regardless of his origins, he has cut a bloody swath through the centuries. He descended on times and places, killed, fed, but left no evidence that he was a vampire. His only continuous modus operandi was that he never maintained one. Each place, each period in which he killed, he always had a different method to fool the locals. A horrible accident in Rome, a mysterious disease in Paris, and a ruthlessly brutal serial killer in London. But all were just decoys to hide his thirst for blood. It was in London in 1888 that my brother and I came close to capturing him. I was informed, rather late in the game I'm afraid, that Bloody Jack was behind the East End murders of London. I had found this out while mentally interrogating another fiend. Knowing well that Jack would not stay in London long, we quickly made passage to the British Isles. Once in London, we began to hunt our quarry. Employing our necromancer skills, we performed summoning spells all around the East End for several nights in a row. Much to our chagrin, we did not call forth even one bloodsucker. Usually with that type of spell in such a large city, we would at least rouse a brood of scimitar, but our efforts were fruitless. On our fourth night in London, we were taking rest in a dive tavern in Whitechapel and drowning our disappointment in a few pints when the news of a new Ripper murder found us. At this point, we were sure that Jack the Ripper was a mere mortal, but the murder did intrigue us. It was another young girl by the name of Mary Kelly. She had been found ripped to shreds in her bed. We obtained her address, 13 Miller's Court, and made haste to her flat. It was still dark, but dawn was an hour away. We found the place to be overrun by Scotland Yard, so there was no way to examine the body for any signs of vampirism. But I soon realized that was not necessary. My ability to sense vampires has become quite keen over the years, though my brother says that I am just lucky when it comes to spotting the undead. In any case, I eyed a figure just north of the crime scene lurking in an alley. Without warning, I grabbed my brother's shoulder and ran toward the alley. Once there, the figure had vanished. Panting from the exertion, my brother accused me of insanity, and for a moment I thought he might have been correct. Deciding to err on the side of my intuition, I performed the vampire summoning spell. My brother stood behind me and scoffed at my attempt. Once finished, I let a few moments pass as I stared into the inky darkness of the Whitechapel alley, and then a voice from behind me arose in song.
Only a violet I plucked when but a boy, and oft times when I am sad at heart this flower has given me joy. But while life does remain in memoriam I'll retain this small violet I plucked from mother's grave.
This was not my brother's voice that sang. It was a preternatural voice that I had come to know all too well as one belonging to a vampire. I turned to see my brother clutched by the throat. The ghastly figure that held him was indeed the fiend we sought. His long fingers were wrapped around poor Eugene's windpipe like the death grip of a python. My brother struggled to no avail. Release him now, I commanded, but it was useless, for I had not taken him under my control with the spell of necromancy. With my brother's life at stake, I quickly began the spell. The fiend laughed at me, tightening his grip on Eugene's throat.
Your magic will not serve you tonight, necromancer,
Bloody Jack hissed.
I am immune to your tricks.
As he spoke, he tilted his head toward the flickering gaslight that poured in from the street beyond. I could see his features in the dim light. His monstrous face was tattooed with familiar symbols. This fiend had armed himself by tattooing a protection spell on his face. No necromancy could ever break through that barrier as long as the tattoos remained in place. The next moments were a blur of motion. Instinctively, I charged the bloodsucker with my walking stick serving as my lance. Bloody Jack had already begun to sink his fangs into the soft neck of Eugene. Luckily, my makeshift weapon struck the vampire before too much blood was drawn, and he dropped my brother to the cobblestones below. The bloodsucker retreated backwards and hissed at me. He regained his composure and smiled. With the tip of his hat, he made off up the side of the adjacent building with supernatural speed. As I helped my brother to his feet, I was quite dumbfounded as to what had occurred. Bloody Jack should have been able to dispose of both of us. We were defenseless without our necromancy, and his tattooed face had rendered that useless. Then it dawned on me what had happened. Years earlier, I had taken the time to rub garlic oil and wormwood into my walking stick. It was an extra precaution I took when I was just starting out in my trade. Over all the years before that night in London, I had never had a call to use it. My necromancy skills had always served me well, so I had completely forgotten my walking stick and what I had infused it with. Vampires, in most cases, are repelled by garlic, but when you add wormwood to the mix, then it becomes a surefire weapon. The long-forgotten precaution paid off. That was the last I heard of Bloody Jack for a very long time. I tried to find him at other times, but I never caught his trail again. That is, of course, until I found him in the possession of Dr. Tantalus. I have to admit I was impressed with the good doctor for capturing him, and I wondered how he had managed to do so. That became apparent when I once again saw Bloody Jack. His tattooed face was the same as I remembered it, but with one very important exception. A long scar ran across his face, severing the tattooed symbols and rendering them useless. Dr. Tantalus, or someone else perhaps, had found something that would permanently scar a vampire. Normal cuts on a vampire will heal without a trace, and nothing I have ever found could make a permanent wound like that on one of the undead. It still remains somewhat a mystery to me, but what is life without a little mystery? You can see Bloody Jack, aka Jack the Ripper, a truly diabolical and mysterious vampire, in our horrifying Necromancer show. Vosculus, the Queen. I must now warn you, kind readers, that I have reserved the most phantasmagorical tale for last. This is the part that calls into question everything you may know of reality and shake the very foundations of your sanity. I shall not blame you if you stop here and refuse to read another word. However, if you made it this far, then it would be a shame not to learn of Vosculus, for she is the queen of all vampires. She is the fountainhead from which they all sprang, or at least that is what the legends say. Allow me to begin by recounting the legend to you as I have come to know it. As you know, I have the ability to probe the minds of vampires who I have taken under my control. Most all the vampires I have taken know the legend, and a few believe it. At some distant time before the dawn of man, there was a race of beings or gods that found themselves stranded upon the virgin earth. They struggled to survive, for the earth was not their natural domain. The food they found here did not nourish them. The one source of nourishment that kept them alive was the blood of animals. Not only were they nourished by the blood, it was an intoxicant. Their need and desire for blood grew, and they became savage in its pursuit. When it came time to return to the heavens, all were reluctant to leave, for their lust for blood had grown so strong. However, all eventually departed, except for one. Her name was Vosculus, and her bloodlust was beyond all the others of her kind. She refused to leave. Eons passed, and Vosculus fed on the blood of all the animals that crawled, flew, and walked upon the earth. When the human race came into existence, she delighted in their blood. Unlike the other animals the earth had to offer, man's blood was very potent. However, man differed from the other beast in that they were intelligent enough and aggressive enough to fight back. For the first time in her long existence, she found herself being stalked by her prey. In an attempt to defend herself, she used some of her own divine blood to resurrect dead humans she had fed upon, so that they could serve as her guard. With her blood in their veins, the newly resurrected humans found they possessed some of her powers and all her bloodlust. Vosculus, along with her new race of vampires, decimated the human population. At humanity's darkest hour, the godlike beings that had left Vosculus on Earth eons before returned. Ashamed of what one of their kind had done to this fledgling race, they gave the humans a way to capture and contain Vosculus. They also provided them with the knowledge to fight and destroy the legions of creatures she had sired. The humans managed to capture Vosculus in the trap the gods had provided for them, and they killed her spawn, except for a few that were driven underground. However, during the struggle, they lost the trap. The vampires stole Vosculus's prison, even though they did not have the ability to free her from it. Over the long centuries, the vampires have kept Vosculus's prison hidden. They await a time when she can be freed from her cage and lead them to dominate the world once more. That is the legend. I have heard a number of variations on it over the years, but that is the general theme. For the longest time, I never believed the legend. I felt it was a fancy fairy tale that vampires told themselves to give their horrid existence meaning. Of course, all legends, even ones belonging to vampires, often have some basis in facts, no matter how clouded those facts may be. Over the years, I have pieced together bits of information that led me to believe that there was once an alpha vampire, a vampire that was the beginning of all blood-sucking fiends, and that perhaps there was still one somewhere in the world. I set it in my mind that if this vampire truly existed, then it would be mine. I set about putting clues together that would lead me to this source. Each new vampire I would take into my control was mentally interrogated for whatever knowledge of Vosculus I could rip from their minds. And in many cases I did have to rip it from them, for they do like to guard their secrets, but few can resist my probing. However, my efforts were in vain over many years. Most of the new information that came to me never got me any closer to locating this alleged queen. That disappointing circumstance changed once I found Bloody Jack. Bloody Jack, aka Jack the Ripper, came into my possession when I acquired Dr. Tantalus's Vampire Freak Show. Jack had been a prize I had coveted for a long time, and not just because he was an infamous fiend. Several vampires had given up information to me that led me to believe that Bloody Jack knew the location of Vosculus's prison, and much to my delight, he did. Getting the location was no easy task. I plumbed the depths of his thoughts in an attempt to gain the truth of his origins, but that search was just a red herring. Once he had his guard up against me to defend his own past, I quickly turned my search of his mind to Vosculus. I was able to glean one word from him before he blocked me: Abdusa. At the time, I was angered by the small amount of information I got from him, but it turned out to be all I needed. Abdusa is a small village along the banks of the Nile in Egypt. From my research, I found that Abdusa held nothing of importance. What even made it a village was beyond me. I sent a spy to the village to find out what he could. I would have gone myself, but my brother and I would not have blended in with the indigenous population. I knew if Abdusa held any secrets, they would not be given up to outsiders. After several weeks, my spy reported back. Based on his report, I was sure Abdusa held a dark secret. My spy informed me that all the people of the village belonged to the cult of Asar. I have encountered many primitive religions and cultist practices in my travels, so that did not shock me. What shocked me is how they worshipped their deity. According to my trusted informant, these villagers kidnapped people from all over northern Africa and sacrificed them to Asar. There was a pit disguised as a well by the villagers, But it was no ordinary well. They called it the Blood Temple, and with due ritual, they would toss their victims into the pit. It is my experience that any would-be deity requiring living blood sacrifices is usually a vampire in God's clothing. Regardless of whether Assar had anything to do with the legendary Vosculus, I intended to find out what lay in that pit. My brother and I mounted an expedition to Egypt. We hired a few mercenaries to deal with the more human violence that we would encounter. As I suspected, my hired men did have to dispatch a fair number of the cultists in order to get access to the pit. Once we secured the location, my brother and I were lowered into the Blood Temple. When we reached the bottom, our torches revealed a stone floor littered in bone and dried gore. I could not begin to fathom the vast numbers of people that died in that spot as a sacrifice to whatever lay in the dark beyond. As our eyes adjusted to the intense darkness, we could begin to make out the stone ruins that lay in front of us. Before we could commence to explore the horrid tomb, we were set upon by a swarm of half-deads. They had been mummified and wrapped tight to keep their decaying flesh from falling to dust. Eugene began to flail his torch madly at the undead horde. I quickly performed the spell to take them under control, but their numbers were so vast that I could barely get the words out before I was in their rotting grasp. Luckily, Eugene's swinging torch kept them at bay long enough for my spell to take hold of them. With an army of mummified half-deads at my command, we continued to look for their former master. Our search was not long. We discovered a sealed chamber no more than 300 feet from where we entered the Blood Temple. The seal bore markings so ancient that I did not recognize them. I later discovered that the writing stated, "Beyond this wall lies Vosculus, in the god's crimson veil, a slumbering queen to waken upon a blood tide." I had found her. The legend, a lesser necromancer would have never opened that door. The fear that arose in me was gut-wrenching. For someone like myself who fears little, this was quite rare, but I did not let it stop me. I had my legion of mummies set about removing the stone seal. It was very heavy, and a few of the half-deads were crushed to dust in the process. Once it was almost open, we heard a monstrous cry of anger and rage emanating from the darkness behind us. Eugene raised his torch in the direction of the sound. What the flickering firelight revealed would have shattered an ordinary mortal's mind. The beast that came from the dark was a 10-foot-tall Nosferata. Its gaping mouth bore blood-stained fangs several inches long, and it had no eyes in its bulbous head. This was the mighty Assar, the protector of Vosculus. Quickly I ordered my half-dead mummies to attack. They swarmed upon Assar in such numbers that he almost became completely obscure by their mass. With a terrifying roar, he shook off the mummies, sending their bodies crashing into the walls of the temple. Most exploded in clouds of dust as they hit the wall. I began the spell to take him under my control as Eugene charged him with his torch. Assar grabbed Eugene with his talon-like hand and lifted him to the stone ceiling. Eugene was screaming and flailing in the clutch of the giant vampire just as I finished my spell. For a brief moment, I thought my necromancy had failed me. The Nosferata seemed unaffected. Then he released his grip on Eugene, letting him fall to the hard floor, and I knew I had him. To test my control, I ordered Assar to finish removing the stone seal from Vosculus's chamber. With an almost visible reluctance, he obeyed, removing the stone from something he had guarded for eons. A red light spilled from the chamber. We could not see beyond the light, and it took a little coaxing to get Eugene to follow me in. Once beyond the threshold, we entered a smoky, otherworldly chamber that gave off a feeling of immense dread. If I tried for a million years, I could not describe to you the feeling in words. It was just wrong. In the center of the chamber was a strange sarcophagus. We made our way to it through the sinister gloom. The sarcophagus had a window built into the front. As we approached, the window revealed a shriveled husk of something not human. It was Vosculus, the queen of the vampires. She was blood-starved and appeared dead, but I knew that was not true, for I could hear her. In my mind, she called for me to release her, and a part of me wanted to obey. However, I have not come this far in my line of work to listen to what vampires whisper in my head. No, I did not release the greatest blood drinker of all time. It had occurred to me long before I set out to find Vosculus that if the legends bore any truth, then even though she was a vampire, by definition she was not really undead. If she was not one of the undead, then I would have no control over her. That would not be a good thing for the sake of us all. Also, I came to find out that even if I had been able to release her from her sarcophagus, She would not be able to leave the bizarre cell in which the sarcophagus lay. I have had other vampires enter that chamber, but they have never been able to leave. They tried, but apparently the light acts as a one-way door for bloodsuckers. They can go in, but they are fried coming back out. So, Vosculus is safe in her prison. I would not dream of removing her, but I did remove the temple and the prison that held her. As long as she is safely trapped, why not put her on display for you, my curious patrons? And after I worked so hard to find this great legend, I was not going to just leave it set under the desert. I had the entire blood temple removed along with Asar, a few half-dead mummies, and of course Vosculus herself. If you, my faithful patron, come see the Witherspoon Necromancer Show, you can witness these horrors for yourself in relative safety. Epilogue. I have given you a mere glimpse inside the world of the Witherspoon brothers. The horrific wonders that lie within the walls of our show are far more than I could ever put into words. You will have to see it to believe it. You can walk among the undead without fear of physical harm, thanks to our skilled necromancy. Behold things no living soul has ever seen and remain alive to tell of it. But be warned, though I guarantee your personal safety, I cannot guarantee your sanity. That is a risk you will have to take if you want to be amazed at the Witherspoon Brothers Necromancer Show.